I feel very sad that my profession has not taken the harms that drug treatments can do more seriously. Very sad about that. I'm very sad that the profession is neglecting the other ways that we can help people. It's neglecting to develop other possibilities and other avenues to help and support people and to enable people to help and support themselves and each other. Of course, there were people in the psychiatric profession who very nobly have stood up and been critical of drug treatments. There have always been people like that. But too many people, I think, too many psychiatrists have just accepted that drug treatments are good and have not wanted to contemplate that actually these treatments could be harmful.
So I've called this mainstream view the disease-centred model of drug action. And this is the idea, as I said, that these drugs are working by correcting an underlying abnormality. And it's an idea that's borrowed from general medicine, where most drugs are also understood to act in that way. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the drug is targeting the cause of the disorder. So, for example, insulin in diabetes might be a drug that you think of as working in this way. It's not treating the cause of diabetes, but by replacing the deficient insulin supply, it's helping to normalize, it's helping to rectify the underlying abnormality, helping to normalize the body. So the other way that we can think about what psychiatric drugs might be doing is what I've called the drug-centred model, and I've called it this to emphasize that these drugs are drugs, that is, substances that alter the way that the body functions. And what I'm suggesting in this model is that far from working by normalizing the body, these drugs are working by creating an abnormal or altered state. And because they are a special sort of drug called psychoactive drugs, that is, they work on the brain and therefore they alter feelings, thoughts, emotions, and behavior, the altered states they create interact with the symptoms or problems that we call mental disorders. And sometimes these altered states may be useful in someone who is suffering from a deep depression or an intense psychotic state. But it's not that anything's been normalized, it's that the altered state the drugs create may be preferable to the mental experiences that they're having at the time. So an example of this way of thinking about drugs that's maybe not too controversial is the idea that alcohol is useful for social anxiety disorder, which was something I was taught when I was training, just in case you think that I'm just bringing that in. So the idea was not that alcohol corrected a chemical imbalance or obviously that it replaced an alcohol deficiency. The idea was that the characteristics of alcohol intoxication, which we're all familiar with, include becoming socially less inhibited, which can be useful for someone who is who finds social situations difficult. Psychiatric drugs are psychoactive substances, and this is sometimes forgotten, so this is just why I'm putting this slide up. There is no fundamental difference between them and other psychoactive substances. The ones we're familiar with, of course, are the substances that are used recreationally. The difference might be that most psychiatric drugs produce states that are not particularly pleasant, but that doesn't mean that they're fundamentally different in any way. They still, like all drugs, alter the body, and like all psychoactive drugs, because they work on the brain, they produce altered mental states as well. And like all drugs, they produce tolerance. That is, the effects that they have initially don't necessarily last because the body adapts to their presence, and for the same reasons you get withdrawal symptoms when they're stopped. Like other psychoactive substances, the state that they produce means that people are not necessarily very good at judging how they're functioning when they're under the influence of the drug. What someone called Peter Breggin, an American psychiatrist, has called a process of spellbinding. We're familiar with that with alcohol, for example, aren't we? That we're not necessarily very good judges of what we can do when we're intoxicated with alcohol.
Joanna, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today for the Mad in America podcast. I wanted to ask you about the recent study into antidepressant efficacy announced in The Lancet and widely covered in the UK news media on Thursday, February 22nd. You've written about some of the limitations of that study, including a piece for Mad in America.
So the study is a meta-analysis. So that means that the authors have got the data together from lots of different trials of antidepressants and combined the data to get an overall effect measure. The main conclusion is that antidepressants are more effective than placebo, and that conclusion is what's been used as the basis of the headlines all over the world media to say that it's confirmed that antidepressants work. The problem with that conclusion is that, well, there are numerous problems with it, but one of the problems is that the way that they've analysed the data actually inflates the difference between antidepressants and placebo. And if you analyse the data differently, which in fact they did in their study in the appendices, if you get as far as reading them, they're actually finding effects that show that the difference between antidepressants and placebo are very small. So maybe I'd just like to expand on that a bit more because it's quite a complex point. So the data that they've analysed is what they call response rates. They define response in the same way that most trialists define response, as the percentage of people whose depression rating scale scores dropped by 50% or more during the study. Now, that is an arbitrary definition of response, and it's not the primary data that was collected. The primary data that is collected in these trials is the score that people have on the depression rating scales. So what you should analyse in a trial and in a meta-analysis of trials is the primary data, is the scores on the rating scales. And if you analyse that data, as I said before, what you find is that difference between antidepressants and placebo in terms of depression scores is very small and way below the difference that probably indicates a minimal clinically significant level of improvement.
The other interest group that's obviously been influential in promoting this view of psychiatric drug treatment is the pharmaceutical industry, although interestingly in the 1950s and 60s up to the 1980s, really, the pharmaceutical industry could play both games. They could promote psychiatric drugs as disease-specific or as psychoactive substances, and they were quite happy to do both. But then there was, and they were involved in the early days of creating the modern idea of depression, along with the antidepressants in the 1960s. But then, in the 1980s, there was a crisis over the widespread use of benzodiazepines, and the idea of using mind-altering substances to shut people up, keep people quiet, stop people complaining, got a very bad reputation, rightly, of course. And so, as David Healy's very cleverly shown, they started to change the market for the benzodiazepines into a market for antidepressants. And they needed to get away from that bad reputation. They needed to portray the antidepressants as something that were reversing an underlying disease. So that disease-centered model became very important to them in the early 1990s. So the idea that there was an underlying deficiency or disease was sold in a package with the drugs. They very much came together, the idea that you had a chemical imbalance and therefore you needed an antidepressant in the 1990s with the marketing of the SSRIs like Prozac. Eli Lilly were one of the funders of a big campaign in the UK, and I know there have been campaigns here and campaigns in Australia that are similar, campaigns designed to increase the use of antidepressants by increasing the number of people who are diagnosed with depression. So this campaign suggested that 5% of the general population had depression, 10% of people attending general practitioners. It emphasised that antidepressants are not addictive, which has transpired as completely wrong and is now accepted as completely wrong. And it emphasised that they should be given for a few months and not just used for a brief period. It was very successful. We've already seen how much the prescribing of antidepressants has increased. I'm trying to suggest that there's a better way of thinking about what drugs might be doing when we use them for mental health problems, that we need to acknowledge that they're drugs, that they're psychoactive substances, and we need to understand those effects more. And when we do that, we can use them in a rational and more collaborative way and a more cautious way, because this The point about the disease-centred model that I think is so dangerous is that it assumes that drug treatment is going to be beneficial. Because, of course, if there's an underlying problem and the drugs are helping to normalise it, well, of course it's a good idea to take them. Why wouldn't you? The drug-centred model, on the other hand, by emphasising that these substances are drugs, assumes that they might be harmful, and therefore you have to make a good case for using them. And I hope that I've shown you that I think it's only when we stand back from this literature that you're able to realise how we've got to this situation where we have a potentially dangerous and completely unfounded model of the way that psychiatric drugs work. That model has become the standard accepted way of understanding these substances and the basis on which they are used. It's all based on the idea that the drugs are somehow rectifying some underlying problem. And until we understand that they're not doing that, or that we've got no evidence that they're doing that, we don't really know how to interpret the evidence we've got. So, for example, if you give children a sedative drug like an antipsychotic and measure their mania scores will go down a bit. They will be less hyperactive, less irritable, and they'll sleep more. That doesn't mean that we've cured anything or done anything very useful. What we've done is we've sedated those children. And until we understand what the drugs we give to people are doing, we don't know how to interpret the evidence. That's my position on it.
Why not? Because people talk about fantastic results.
But people have always talked about fantastic results with all sorts of therapies that we now know were completely useless and often quite dangerous. So you have to do proper studies, and what the proper studies show, as you probably know, is that drugs like antidepressants are only very minimally different from a placebo. And that minimal difference, in my opinion, is because they are psychoactive, mind-altering drugs. They make people feel different, they suppress their emotions a bit. So that's what we're doing to people. That's why we need to understand what the drugs are that we're using. What sort of effects do they have? What sort of mind-altering, behaviour-altering effects do they produce? And I think that the effects that, say, antidepressants produce are just not useful. I don't see why being a little bit suppressed emotionally is going to help someone and feeling a bit groggy and having your libido taken away. I don't see why that's going to help someone who's depressed. And what I'm saying is we really have no evidence that these drugs are curing depression.
À-bas-le-ciel.